Hello and welcome, I'm Tafaragadamu. My guest today, Dr. Jos Van Beurden, is a Dutch academic and author who has extensively written on looted cultural and historical objects, primarily from the African continent and by, of course, colonialists. What can be done to return those looted objects? Very welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So, I see in your book that you published in 2017, that probably is about 3 years ago, you say in your book called Treasures in Trusted Hands, very iconic, ironic name, title for a book, Negotiating the Future of Colonial Cultural Objects. You cover the cultural and historical objects looted in what is 500 years of European colonialism. It presents quite a number of examples and how these objects were looted. Some of them came to Europe, many European museums as a war booty. Some of them were collected by private European travelers. And of course, also the churches were involved. It's pretty
Well, I have been traveling quite a lot. And at first, I just went to visit cultural places. You know, churches, palaces, mosques, museums, etc. And at a certain moment, I became aware that, you know, there was a terrible maldistribution between what countries in Africa or Asia have and what countries in Europe possess from their former colonies. And at first I was focusing on the ongoing illicit trade in art and antiquities. So, you know, the things which are disappearing today. But at a certain moment, you know, there came rules and regulations to limit this illicit trade. And then I discovered that for colonial objects, nothing has been arranged. You know, if like Ethiopia, if they want to get back their Magla treasures, they cannot say, you know, well, there's this and this law or convention which forces you to give it back. There's just nothing. So, and the same for Nigeria, for the Republique de Benin, for Congo, etc. So then they are dependent upon the goodwill of the other side. And the goodwill usually is very limited, you know, whether they get something back. So for the last 10 years, I've been focusing particularly on colonial objects from colonial contexts. And one important experience was that in 1991, I was in Mali in West Africa. And there I met with the director of the National Museum, Samuel Sidibé. And Dr. Sidibé said to me, well, we have a tremendous problem because during colonialism, many things disappeared. And after independence, it continued. And he said, and we as Malians, we are part of the problem. And then I said, we are the other side of the problem. We are part of it as well. And that was the first time that I met a museum director in Africa who was also clear about his own share in the problem. And that made it much easier and attractive for me to work on it. And he is still one of my best friends. And, you know, because for me it was a very crucial moment, because in Mali I went to several places along the river Niger and saw how, you know, graves have been looted, how other places have been looted, you know, the crates in the soil and so on. And so much has disappeared. They even say that more than 80% of their cultural heritage is abroad nowadays.
This is after most African countries went independent. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, but you know, it continues. Sorry to interrupt you. It continues. You know, it happened during colonialism. And then it was, you know, the looting was often done by government officials, by military and so. And it continued after independence. And then the looting was done by traders, by dealers, by people who paid local looters and so.
But during the colonial times, you basically squarely lay the blame on the colonial masters, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you know, those were the colonial masters, but also the scientists who came there. The missionaries, of course, who came there.
Also the chroniclers, yeah.
Smuggled objects. but they were mostly from the European side.
So in large measure, there is no way the Africans could have been part of the problem before they went independent, right?
Well, no, but after independence.
Basically, most of the objects that we see in museums across Europe, including your own country, the Netherlands, were looted from primarily from West Africa and a bit from Southern Africa. Is that correct?
No, I mean, in the Netherlands, there's also a lot from Asia, because the Dutch colonialism was strongest in Asia.
No, I know, but we are talking about the African continent and the ones that the Europeans have looted from Africa. So basically, it's a large measure from West Africa.
Yeah, it is from West Africa. That's correct. Yes, I would say Congo, of course, was looted a lot, but also Angola,
Benin, Mali,
Nigeria, Benin. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
So
we see it in our museums and private collections.
Private collections, yes. So what types of objects have been looted? If you, in a nutshell, there are
many of the objects. They represent the culture of the place from where they came. So many were religious, or they were ceremonial objects, representing the power of the rulers. And so many of these objects, they are related to the identity of these peoples, and those got lost.
So mostly you find them in museums, right?
They're visible in museums, but they are also in private collections.
Private collections as well, right. So are people now trading in those objects, you think?
It still happens, because every now and then you see that, treasures which were taken during the colonial days, that they pop up in auctions, for instance. It happens that Benin objects, which were looted by British soldiers in 1897, and they got spread over the whole world. It happens that these pop up in auctions. Recently, there was an auction in the north of France, and then I think 27 objects which had been looted in 1892 by French soldiers, they were auctioned there. But they didn't get through, because there was a group of African people and they interrupted the auction. And then finally the auction decided to withdraw those objects from auction. And now they are back in the Republic of Benin in West Africa. So that's exception. But they do pop up you see it in the trade, and even in shops when I'm in Amsterdam, in the streets where the antiquarians are based, then I also notice them. Yeah. But more in Brussels and Paris and London and New York.
It's very interesting. If we come specifically to Ethiopia, what comes to mind is the loots from Magdala from the second half of the 19th century. This is pretty familiar. You've talked about that a lot of times. Yeah, and they basically are not, basically they are in museums in England, right?
In the UK, in British collections.
UK, right, that's right.
Royal Family, the British Museum, Victoria Albert.
Exactly. And some of these objects cannot be auctioned. Like, for example, the tablets, the holy tablets. I think 7 or 8 of them. They are still housed in one of the museums. Correct?
Yeah. Yeah. No. Of course, because there will be public protest, or definitely from the Ethiopian embassy or the Ethiopian diaspora. And auction houses and dealers, they know nowadays that certain objects they should not bring into the open anymore. But that does not mean, that, say, behind closed doors, things are traded from one party to the other.
Do you know of some?
It happens. Yeah, I know it. I remember it, but that's from Asia. I remember it from statues from Afghanistan.
That after the war, yeah.
Yeah, it happens with Knox statues from Nigeria. Yeah.
But I'm talking about Ethiopian artifacts.
I'm not aware of any Magdala treasures, which have been traded in this way. few returns from private sources. But I've always wondered, because if you look at Nigeria and the Benin treasures, the Benin bronzes, which are at present, say, almost Africa's most iconic case of looted art, next to the Nefertiti buste from Egypt, which is in Berlin. And now the Nigerians, they're really trying a concerted effort to get at least some of them back. And I miss that for the Magdala treasures, because the case is very obvious. It's as obvious as the Benin objects. Benin objects 1897, Magdala 1868. We all know it, and I miss that Ethiopia is really making a concerted effort to get them back. Every now and then I hear about it, like the president wrote a letter about it. There are requests. There is a civil society organization helping it, but
it looks like
they should help each other.
It looks like we are on downtime as far as the restitution of the Magdala loots are concerned. But there are other objects that have been looted. We don't know how, but for example, the cross from Lalibela. I guess you have a copy on your table right in front of you. So that was looted in no, a copy of it. Don't you have a copy of it similar to that?
No, it's not similar. No.
So okay, that was stolen, I guess, in 1996 and returned a few years back.
Yeah. Well, the point with that was, it was an outcry in Ethiopia. I remember it. It was in the newspaper, on the news, etc. And then the police started looking for it. They couldn't find it, but they kept looking for it. And at a certain moment, they found a trace. And in Lalibela, you had a small hotel called the Roha Hotel. It's not the big one, it's a small one. And the owner of it and his son, had been involved. And the story went that, the owner of the hotel had a daughter who was ill all the time. And he had repeatedly asked one of the priests from the Lalibela compound to come with the cross to his house to bless her. And the priest had always said, no, we cannot do it. But at a certain moment, it was raining, cats and dogs. There were two guards, but one of them was ill and the other was hiding for the rain. And then one of the priests went inside, he took it from up there. And then he went to the house of the hotel owner. And there, he blessed the girl. And then he took, as a good custom, he took a little drink and he fell asleep. And when he woke up, the cross had disappeared. And then there was alarm in Lalibela, and the police, 40 people were arrested. And last year I was in Ethiopia, I was in Lalibela, and I still met one of the people who were arrested at that time. And he really remembered this because, they were slightly beaten, by the police in order to tell their stories. But, they had to give it up. But at a certain moment, it turned out, the customs in Belgium, the cross went to Europe. I will tell the story. The cross went to Europe and it was arrived at the airport of Brussels, at Zaventem Airport. And there were some custom officials at that time, and they were just a little bit more aware of the possibility of stolen art than the years before. And on the packet it said handicrafts or something. But often handicrafts, is a euphemism for stolen art. But you think, oh, handicraft, not important. So they opened it and they saw an imported cross. They did not know what it was. And then they alerted the Ethiopia's ambassador in Brussels. And fortunately, he was rather culturally minded, because that helped, not all diplomats, but he was. And he went to the airport and he immediately had a feeling, well, this is a cross, we need to get it back. And his first thought was, I'm going to engage a lawyer in order to force the buyer in Belgium to give it back. But then this lawyer, she said to him, don't do it, because in that case, you have to prove that this man who bought it, he was living near Brussels, that he could not know that it was illegal to export it. And if he said, yeah, I really didn't know it, then he has to prove it. Now, you never can prove that. And the reason was that at that moment, Ethiopia had not yet signed a convention, an international convention, the UNESCO 1970 Convention against the illicit trade, etc., and nor did Belgium. So the two countries had no means to force a purchaser, someone who had bought an object, a stolen object, to give it back. So what happened, it was really a thing of injustice, you know. What happened was that the person in Belgium, he got back his money, the full amount, and he gave the cross. Whereas in Ethiopia, an antiquities dealer and some of its aides, they got into prison. But the person in Belgium, he was as guilty as the antiquities dealer, because the person in Belgium, he had been quite often in Ethiopia. So you know that the main cross of Lalibela, you know, you're not supposed to buy that. You're not supposed to purchase it. So that was a good lesson from it.
Let be learned, yeah. So speaking of restitution, this was of course done differently, but with the Ethiopian government then, the Ethiopians went to demonstrations, signed petitions and all that stuff to bring back, for example, the most significant restitution ever made in Ethiopia. One of the most significant restitution efforts would involve the Aksum obelisk. As you know, it was returned, you know, because of the pressure that was applied on the Italian government. So how can African governments, particularly Ethiopia, get stolen objects, cultural or religious or whatever?
Well, I think to begin with, they should change from a politics of incidents to a more structural policy.
In other words?
I will explain it. For instance, Rwanda, they have had a cultural policy since 2008, and part of this policy is restitution of objects, human remains, and archives. And you really need a policy. That means you need a unit in the administration of the country, a few specialists, and they have to focus on it. And then you have to put in a policy, you have to put priorities.
But that's not an end in itself, as you very well know, because you might have that policy, which we don't have in Ethiopia. I agree that it has to be instituted, but putting together a policy in your own country is not much of help in a way, because you need a partner who would be ready to return those objects. In these cases, European governments and so on.
But you see, I mentioned already Nigeria, which does have such a policy in relation to the Benin objects. And the neighboring country of Nigeria, which is the Republic of Benin, they also have such a policy. And they are really making success. France has offered to return 26 pieces of war booty to the Republic of Benin. So you really see that it is useful. Namibia has done the same. You know, they have a national hero in Namibia, Hendrik Witbooi. Well, the name might not be familiar to you, but he was a really anti-colonial hero. And the Germans, they took several of his objects, among them a Bible and a whip. And now the Germans, they really have made a concerted effort. And now these two, the Bible and the whip, they're back in Namibia. So you really need that policy. Now, if we go to Europe, to answer your question, I'm inclined to think there is a change in Europe. Not everywhere.
Are you talking about this policy which is put in place by Emmanuel Macron in France?
That is one example. So Emmanuel Macron, I think in November 2017, he delivered a speech in Burkina Faso in which he promised that France would develop a restitution policy, because he said, you know, it's ridiculous that so many objects are in France and so few in Africa. That's just one example. But Germany is doing the same. In the Netherlands is doing the same. Scottish museums are doing the same. You know, in Belgium, they're discussing now both with the Democratic Republic of Congo and with Rwanda about returns. And I feel that many people, just in the public, many heritage officials, museum curators, museum directors, they start to feel uneasy about, you know, the war booty which we have here. And what is encouraging them is that, for instance, that several African countries, they are strengthening their museum infrastructure. Like, you know, Senegal, they have just opened 1 year or 1.5 years ago, a new museum of Black civilizations. They're really looking for collections. Now, this is just, this is an up-to-date modern museum. In Kinshasa, they're building a museum, new. In Nigeria, they're building one for the Benin objects. So many, I mean, it's, you know, it's better, it's encouraging Western countries to become more generous, but we are not there.
Exactly. Oh, exactly. As a follow-up to that, I mean, now that you raised these issues about cultural centers and museums, I mean, although they might be interested in restituting these objects, the institutions in Africa are pretty much underdeveloped and would be exposed, actually, these objects would be exposed to further looting. Does that make sense to you?
Yes and no. Because what I often see is that European museums or government, they use this argument for not to have to give back. Because in fact, they're trying to postpone it as long as possible. And then they say, yeah, but you're not ready to receive them, so we cannot do it now. Now, if you allow me to give one example of the opposite, you know that Macron, I told you, President Macron of France, he has offered 26 objects back to the Republic of Benin. And you know what happened? The Republic of Benin said, wait a few years, because first we have to strengthen our infrastructure. And Macron is impatient because he is a politician and he wants to become popular with it. But in Benin, they said, wait with it, you know, and then we will give the sign when we are ready to receive them. They did another thing, is that in the fight against the French in 1892, there was women were fighting, they were participating in the fight, and they were quite crucial. And now they have asked to add 3 rows of decorations for women, which are also in France, because they say we have to represent our history, and our history is not complete without, you know, these signs of the women. That means that they really are developing a policy. They know what they want, and they even say, you know, before it was that an African country would ask for objects back, and then a European country tried to postpone it. Now it has turned around, and the African country says, no, wait a minute, wait until we are ready for it. So that means that if you really go into dialogue, if you really show willingness to return objects, then the African country can also become open about its own weaknesses and say, you know, we need more for this, more time, or we need this or that, and solve it.
So what do you make of the Ethiopian army? I mean, if Macron decides to return these objects, I mean, one comes to mind, the paintings stolen from a church near Gondar, right, many years ago. That's in somewhere in France, right?
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting because they have a special room in the big ethnographic museum in Paris, the Musée du Quai Branly. And it would be a loss for them, that's obvious, but they should go back. And when Macron launched his new policy, he appointed 2 advisors, a French art historian, Bénédicte Savoy, and a Senegalese writer, Felwine Sarr. And these 2, they wrote an advice for the president. And in the advice, they said that looting from scientific expeditions, like this one, like the one from Gondar, should go back immediately. And Macron has postponed that for some other reason. Maybe he thought, you know, politically, I cannot make it in France. You know, he has to deal with several factors. But in my view, it should go back. I mean, it's quite obvious. It was stolen and it was trickered away by these expedition members. And the interesting thing is that, you know, and that's why research is so important, that if you look in diaries of French members of that expedition, they describe themselves how they cheated the local population. You just can read it there. So, you know, study is important. That's also why you need a policy with priorities.
And as you can see hanging on the wall, you have a 16th century icon, a copy of which which is now at the Institute of Ethiopian Studies of the Addis Ababa University. What do you think? Do you think that Ethiopian institutions are ready to house all these objects that have been looted in case European governments decide to return them anytime?
Well, I think we have to distinguish between two questions. The first question is whether European institutions have objects which they should not have, about which we say nowadays we should have never taken them. That's one question. The second question is...
Well, that part could be addressed by returning them to the churches, like we're talking about the holy tablets, right?
That's an option.
That's one, but the others, yeah.
But the point is that if they return it, first of all, they arrive at the border, and there are the national authorities or the federal authorities, and they say, give them to us, and don't mingle. It's not your business what we do with it. And you see this in Nigeria, they've solved this because there is an agreement between the federal government and the government of Edo State, in which this Benin city is placed, and the Royal House of Benin, you know, what they will do with the treasures when they come back. Now, very often such an agreement does not exist, but, you know, it can be part of the dialogue. And of course, like I would favor that.
So, I mean, my question is, my question is
from where they were taken.
My question is has Ethiopia invested enough in its cultural institutions to be able to house all these objects that would perhaps return in the years ahead?
There have been some new museums have been set up. Ethiopia is not ready for it. I will tell you frankly, if I am in Addis Ababa, I always go to the National Museum. I go downstairs to say hello to Lucy. I always do it. It's a ritual almost. But if I look at the National Museum, I also think what a lost chance. Because it's dark, it's not really attractive. It hasn't changed for ages, you know, the whole setup. And I miss that. If I'm at the Museum of the Institute of Ethiopian Studies, I see they have set up a whole new floors, you know, where they are exhibiting in a very responsible way ancient manuscripts and so and other things. Yeah, and then I see another Ethiopia. I know that in Mekelle, a new museum, or in Axum, a new museum is arising. So yeah, Ethiopia is somewhere halfway, but as far as I'm concerned, it could be a bit more, if I'm frank.
Yes, Jos, thank you very much indeed. I would have loved to talk a lot more about this, but we are always constrained by time. So thank you very much indeed, Jos, for your insight into the restitution of looted cultural and historical objects. Look forward to having you.
Me as well. Thank you very much.